Your show will go live in 5 seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1. Blog Talk Radio.
Now we can see a new world coming into view. A world in which there is a very real prospect of a new world order. The new world order does not mean surrendering our national sovereignty or forfeiting our interests.
He took an oath to defend the Constitution of the United States of America. By some, he's been called controversial.
How can I convince you when your ears refuse to hear? You turn your heart away from me each time when I draw near. Your eyes refuse to meet with mine, they glance away in fear.
Now, keep in mind that some of my guests have been approached by Homeland Security or FBI saying, why are you going on the Clay Douglas show?
My message to those guys, if they're listening this morning, is go get a cup of coffee. Maybe you'll learn something.
We both took the same ball, to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. I don't recall there being an expiration date on that.
Well, it's just a show. How can I explain the same as the same? Knowing that your eyes are blinded by the light.
He is the free American, Clay Douglas.
Blinded by the light.
Catch the Free American weekdays at 7 a.m. Pacific, 10 a.m. Eastern.
Every time I think about the damage that's been done, the anger will inside me till I'm almost overcome. I want to tear the moon out of the sky and stop the sun.
For the podcast and more details, visit www.freeamerican.com or catch the podcast by phone by calling 832-999-8681.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another edition of the Free American. I'm your host, I'm Clay Douglas, and I feel like just kicking back a little bit today and letting somebody else talk. So I'm going to share with you a conversation with a gentleman I met many years ago from Ireland, Michael Tsarion. Hopefully I can get him on live, but meanwhile, this gentleman talks about, well, a lot of the things that I talk about here. And from a different perspective, from an Irish perspective. And the guest I've had on for Ireland points out that they've been occupied for 800 years. And Michael will touch a little bit on that, as well as the ancient aliens, and I have a whole different viewpoint on ancient aliens, and I think Tsarion actually agrees with me. I had something interesting happen the other day. I called up my sister. Now, my sister's older than me, so she's in her 70s, and I asked for the phone number of her sons, my nephews. She wouldn't give it to me. Said they didn't want to talk to me. Now, when I got out of the hospital, I really don't remember. This is over 10 years ago. And something happened. Something happened in there, and frankly, I don't know what it is. My family was told that I had a severe brain injury. And they were told to get guardianship and all that, and make arrangements for long-term care. And that didn't work, because courts sent out investigators. The investigator talked to me for an hour while my wife sat across from at the desk and told me, you know, I've been doing this for 7 years. I've interviewed 7 head injury patients before you today. You're the most well-recovered head injury patient I've ever seen, I've ever met, I've ever talked with. And I said, well, maybe it was because I wasn't injured quite as badly as they said I was. They had to make up an excuse for keeping me drugged for 3 months. Got no memory of 3 months in the hospital. And the woman that hit me wasn't, I never saw her in court. Nobody was able, supposedly, to find her later. She was in a borrowed car. I never got any much of a settlement. The only thing the Jewish lawyers did was sue the insurance, my own insurance company. And I can still remember what passed for a normal existence, at least for me. Businesses, boats, bikes, fast cars, expensive hotels, nice restaurants, plane flights over oceans, mountains, waving grains, waving fields of grain. These are pleasant memories of beautiful women, casinos, concerts, wives, children, graduation, weddings, penthouse parties, and presidential campaigns, toy runs, deep-sea fishing, sales trips, expos, speaking engagements, making films and working with Hollywood productions, Thanksgiving dinners, Christmas parties, conversations with authors, stars, politicians, and managing thousands of subscriptions. People eager to meet me, shake my hand, shop owners, and sales, advertising, and products across the country year after year. And a few years before the globalist plan that we know of as the New World Order was launched in 2001 with the bringing down of the World Trade Center, the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, engineered and designed by former Stasi members of East Germany. And got a few wars, kill off a lot of people, both Muslims and Christians, Muslims and Americans. But my activism started before Waco, before witnessing the murder of Christian families in Waco, when I discovered almost accidentally the government involvement in drug trafficking. George Bush, as CIA director, did Operation Watchtower, and I wrote about it in my book. But you may not know about it because not many people have seen my book. On May 20th, 2004, all of that ended for me. And I had just for an example, I had a cousin that came see me in the hospital. I don't remember him coming. They said I didn't recognize him. They tried to blame that on a head injury. I blame it on the drugs. I was fed Halcyon, Haldol, Valium, and morphine. And to this day, because nobody from my family will talk to me, I don't know what I did. I don't know what I said. I don't know the reasons for it. Don't know. We were there. We were there, Dad. You did this, you did that, you blamed us for this. Yeah, I blamed you for trying to get guardianship, for not letting me go back to work. The only thing I wanted to do when I got out of the hospital was go back to work. And so to this day, I don't know. Did I have a head injury? Was I insane? Am I insane now for trying to go against this whole new world order? I don't think so. And I think the number of people that have responded, the number of people that are waking up. They're waking up right now. I'm encouraged by that, but frankly, I just don't know. I don't know what has happened here. You know, I lost my wife and I lost my family, and I tried to, I even went on a dating site. Tried to meet somebody, tried to get somebody back into my life, tried to get some cooperation. And what happened is, once I gave them my website, once they went to my website, which is blocked in libraries and other things, once I did that, nobody ever called. I do the show, and I don't get the response that I wanted. Now, I was on a show last night, just to give you an example. I was on a show last night with people that have known me for a lot of years, former subscribers. They couldn't get in the chat room. Today, there is nobody in my chat room. Nobody but me. People have told me, well, we've had problems getting to your chat room. Well, the show last night, nobody was able to get into the chat room. The chat room didn't work. And, of course, they had told people in advance that I was going to be on. So where is this kind of opposition coming from? When I try to tell you about Israel, I've got somebody supposedly Christian, not even Jews, but Christians, railing at me. Well, don't you know Jesus was a Jew? Don't you know? No, I don't know anything of the sort. In my first issue of the Free American, which is available, it's yours for free. All you got to do, when I brought it back online, after publishing it for 20 years with a 10-year break, I brought it back. I've got that first issue up, and it's very powerful. You've got Benjamin Friedman, a Jewish historian, who was attacked in the same way that I was attacked for trying to give you the same information that I've tried to give you. And so the chat rooms are gone. The chat rooms aren't available. I'm not getting donations. I'm not getting orders for a $2.99 friggin' magazine. Why? Because I'm blocked in the library? Why? Because you don't want to know the truth? Is there something else going on here? This is almost that somebody told me one time, you know, Clay, statistically it's impossible for somebody to have the run of bad luck that you've got. That you've had. Give you some examples. Gentleman calls me up from Douglas, Arizona. I've helped him before. I had him on my show. Clay, I want to help you get the Free American started again. I appreciate that, Casey. Casey Nettercott was his name. I appreciate that, Casey. But it's kind of expensive to start a magazine. Clay, I got $1.5 million in one account. Money's not an issue. Come down and talk to me. Buy me breakfast, Casey. I'll be down in the morning. I drove from Phoenix down to Douglas, Arizona the next morning. When I got to Casey's ranch, he was surrounded by Border Patrol agents, and it seems that he had been shot by somebody coming out of Safeway with my breakfast. Didn't kill him. I talked to him later. I went back down and met him. Yes, he wanted to help, but he had to go to Texas to stand trial for a resurrected case of pistol whipping 2 illegal aliens because Morris Dees, the Jewish owner of Southern Poverty Law, one of the people that have attacked me over the years, false patriots, they wanted to retry him on that. And while he was back in Texas, and actually he got time in Texas then, while he was there, Morris Dees sued him on behalf of the 2 illegal aliens. And since he was in court in Texas and didn't show up for the trial, they gave the 70-acre ranch across the Rio Grande from a UN base that they were building. They gave it to the 2 illegals and Morris Dees. When Casey finally got out of prison, he tried to get his money back or tried to get his land back, and he stopped talking to me too. Don't blame him. When you get shot for trying to talk to me, when you get your land stolen for trying to talk to me, for wanting to support me, for wanting to back me, I don't really blame anybody for not wanting to talk to me. What kind of power are we facing here? Is this satanic? Is this political? Why are they so afraid of an old Texas biker? Why? I don't know. I can't answer that. I can ask you to make a donation. I've managed to get my websites back up. I've managed to keep this radio show on the air. I don't know if anybody's listening. If you go to freeamerican.com and click on the donate button, you can send $3, you can send $30, you can send $300. I've managed to keep that working, but is it working? I don't know. I'm not getting the money. I'm not getting the donations. I'm not getting the response. freeamerican.com is my website. My phone number is up on every page. Why doesn't anybody call? Well, we tried to call. It was busy. It's never busy. And most people can call. My friends can call. Both of them, I guess, that I've got left. But kind of why I don't even feel like talking today, so I'm going to let Michael Tsarion talk.
Michael Tsarion is his name. The book, Atlantis, Alien Visitation and Genetic Manipulation, and the background is just absolutely astonishing.
Now, this gentleman that's interviewing him here, back in 2005, is Chris Pirillo, Pirillo, and that's ChrisPirilloShow.com. Thank you, Chris. I think you did a good job in the interview. Here's Michael Tsarion.
Michael, first of all, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to sit down with us tonight and talk about this.
Well, thanks, Chris. It's great. Thanks for that fantastic intro. I really appreciate it. It was good to see you in San Francisco that time. You know, it was always interesting to be on television, and also to see how in this country there is actually more interest in these subjects than there is in Ireland. I mean, you know, coming from Ireland, you'd think that everybody there is like really chalked up on and fully, you know, versed in their own mythology, but it seems to be that that's not my experience. You know, you have your subculture, sure, but in Ireland generally, people are so caught up in the Catholic, Protestant, you know, conflicts and all of that political stuff, which is a very modern phenomena in Irish history. Even though we would say it started in 1690, it's still a very modern thing. The Celtic stuff is thousands of years, you know, it predates that, and most Irish people couldn't really care less about it. You know, you have your Trinity College intellectuals who, you know, study Gaelic and what have you, but in general, it's not anymore, because of the British government and a lot of mind control involvement there, there's been, people have really forgotten about their roots.
Mind control?
Yeah, well, you know, the whole, if anyone studied the operation of the British in Ireland, how they labored to change Gaelic place names, you know, as part of their conquest during the Elizabethan times. And there's a huge effort with the penal laws of the 1700s and what have you to really distance people. I mean, I don't know if a lot of people realize this, and today is St. Patrick's Day, so it's very, very, you know, consequential that we're talking like this. And it was on another radio show in the Bay Area this morning. And, you know, a lot of people don't realize that in Ireland, you know, when people go there and visit, and they want to maybe go and visit their ancestors and what have you, and you go to these cottages, and everybody goes, oh, look at those quaint cottages with the lovely small doors and the lovely small windows. What a lot of tourists don't realize is that the reason why they have such small windows is because the British government taxed the air.
They taxed the air?
They taxed the air. It was illegal to pick up sticks for a fire on the Lord's land. You know, you'd have your hands cut off. And it's known by historians that the so-called penal laws of Ireland were the single most punitive and oppressive rules on any conquered people. These are the penal laws of Ireland in the 1700s. So, you know, it's a miracle that the Irish even kept any kind of sense of identity. And this is the kind of thing I'm talking about that still proliferates, because when this Catholic idea of St. Patrick coming and the Christian hegemony, you know, these are just facts. You know, when this Christian hegemony was sort of superimposed on the old Celtic religion, it had absolutely catastrophic, you know, consequences on the culture of that country. So in modern days, you know, especially when you're growing up young like I did in Belfast, I mean, you have the devil of a time avoiding paramilitary, you know, association or sectarian violence. You know, all my friends, so-called, the people that I went to school with, are either dead or in jail, and that's not, you know, it's something like maybe your black community here would understand, but a lot worse, of course. And then what has happened in this country, you're visited by the troubles at, you know, 9/11, or the Twin Towers, you know, and I have to say it, that as tragic as that is, we live with that kind of thing every day. You know, growing up for 30 years and under martial law. So you're fighting these sort of oligarchical forces that are hell-bent on the suppression of culture and the suppression of the mind. You know, you're seeing them operate in a very small context in Ireland. Here, a huge country, America, we sometimes don't realize that there is a big brother out there because the country's so vast, it's really a continent you're talking about. But when you're dealing with, like, Belfast, Northern Ireland, you're dealing with such a small demographic, such an enclosed place, that it's very obvious to see what exactly the religions and the governments are up to, politically, culturally, religiously. And most of it is mind control. It's just oppression. But then I come to this country, and, you know, this was a hobby. I mean, I started studying Atlantis, you know, and, I mean, let me say the Celtic aspect of it, like what the ancient Celtic records were saying. And that includes, by the way, the English traditions, too. That includes the King Arthur mythologies and what have you, at 13. But had no idea in the wide world that it would ever, you know, I'd ever do a book on it or anything like that. Furthest thing from my mind. I mean, I do other things, you know, that I'm very involved in astrology and have online school and do a lot of different things professionally. This was what I would have called a, you know, a hobby, a side thing. And the next thing you know, it's just that over here there's an overwhelming interest, not only in Irish history, but in the alternative history of the world. And this is where I come in, because my interests are very much in the alternative history.
And when you say alternative history, is it non-Western or just beyond non-Western? Is it a global?
I mean the concealed history of the world. You see, Africa, Russia, as we're now starting to discover, thank God, you know, through some work of some brilliant researchers, and most of them are American again. This brings us right back to the same point again. Most of the greatest alternative historians are from this country. You know, the Jim Marrs of the world. You know, sure, we have Graham Hancock and people from Europe, but there's a lot in this country. There's a whole line of people who've studied the alternative history of the world. And what that means is the suppressed or sequestered history, the actual facts about what really goes on, not the official, you know, stuff that's maybe put in textbooks or certainly in the newspapers, which is 8th grader level. You know, what we're talking about here is the real history of the planet. And these countries, including America, has an occult history. There's nothing sinister about the word occult. It just means the hidden. There's a hidden history of America that a lot of people in this country are going to really need to know about very quickly because of what's coming down now. And we have to know about just something about the secret societies and fraternal orders that move behind government, because as I've learned in Ireland, where this is a very obvious fact, actually, they kind of don't hide this a lot, but you see, it makes perfect common sense that if there are cabals, fraternities that are secret, operating behind religion and government, then it's like you and me, you know, making a promise with our fingers crossed behind our back. If these people have allegiances other than their allegiances to the people of the country, which of course I know they do, then what good are their promises? What good are their political promises, you know? And that's why nothing's ever changed in hundreds of years, because these individuals owe their allegiances to different altars than the altar of humanity and the altar of the people. And we are seeing that every day, but we don't exactly know why.
Okay, so where should we begin with this, Michael? It seems it's a tremendous story,
It is,
and there's so many details. But really, just to understand and to get an overview, where should we begin?
Well, it is a tremendous story. It has been referred to as the greatest story never told, and it does involve the occult histories of the world, and it even involves official history too. Once you understand this alternative history of the planet and of human beings, it will explain so many conundrums and so many other issues within even what we know officially. It certainly explains what's happening in the control echelons of the world, but the real story, as I've discovered it, and remember, these are not my ideas, these are based on my studies of the comparative mythologies of the world. You know, Jack Barringer, whose book Past Shock was a very fine book that got me sort of into a lot of this, another American researcher, he says that there are 30,000 texts in the world that deal with, you know, visitation. These are 30,000, remember, these are the texts that still exist after the burnings and the purgings and what have you, so you can imagine how many hundreds of thousands there would have been had there not been any kind of suppression of these texts.
And when you say visitation, we aren't talking about a life form or a civilization outside of that which we know.
No question about it. Carl Sagan, you know, Professor Hermann Oberth, the father of rocketry science, Frederick Soddy, the father of radium. We have, like I said, Carl Sagan, we have Albert Einstein. The list of scientists who believe this, including Oppenheimer, it goes on and on and on. In my book, I talk about these intellectual sources that had no problem in the wide world accepting this. Many of them wrote on it. Sheldrake, Rupert Sheldrake, understood this. And today, in fact, the leading anthropologists and paleologists in Oxford and Cambridge University, this is Allen and Dallaire, who've written on these subjects, have no problem understanding that the official histories are not correct. But some scholars have gone further to say that, yes, we have in fact been visited, and we still are visited. We've been visited constantly, and it's done, I mean, anyone who imagines for a moment that we're the only life forms in the universe, they need their head checked. I mean, that we don't even need to get into, because that is an absolute fact. You know, there's 400 billion galaxies out there. 450 billion galaxies. So, you know, it's preposterous to assume that we're alone. Now, granted that we're not alone, and granted that other civilizations on other planets have the technology to be able to cross space in whatever way they want to do that. You know, I mean, the Gene Roddenberry's would say it's done with lithium crystals, you know, and Frank Herbert would say, no, they're bending space. I mean, it's wonderful when you get into the science fiction of this, which has also helped us understand, but we really don't understand how it would be done, you know. And this is a whole other field that one day will be taken seriously and will be opened up. But given that there's individuals out there on civilizations who are able to cross the galaxy, we have to accept that this planet in our solar system has been visited many times. This is the first thing. Now, my work, though, focuses on the visitation of one specific group. I do believe that this planet has been visited many times, probably still is, but it's like that old prime directive idea. Anyone who would come here to do their researches, it's obvious from even UFO paranormal sightings that these creatures do not want to be observed, and when they do, when they are observed, they try to get away. That's pretty obvious even from eyewitness accounts, that they are not happy to be observed. You know, they're not, that's why they're, for instance, not hovering over New York City. You know, they're coming to some place in the boonies or whatever, and there's a good reason for that, right?
Well then, but I mean, and just we'll step into it, I'm sure, further on. How do you then explain the amount of sightings, let's say, like the Phoenix Lights? I mean, where this is a major city, and there are people watching, and there are, like, you know, credible sources and witnesses, or even the Mexico City.
Exactly, that huge event. And there are many public sightings all over the world, including the two you've mentioned are probably the most famous. Let's bookmark that, because the reason for that is very, very important. And we should come to that. What I want to do is take you back to the beginning of this concept. You know, and again, this is coming out of the Celtic records. It's coming out of suppressed books. It's coming out of the Bible, the Book of Enoch. It's coming out of apocryphal works. What that means is that these are books that were left purposely out of the Bible because of what they were containing.
Because it was put down by the Council of Nicaea.
Precisely. And
the Bible.
Yes. And they very much wanted to expurge certain books that, you know, were talking about this. So none of this is far-fetched at all. This can be referenced. My book is full of the references of it. There are many others that can be referenced. On my website I have innumerable links for people to check this out themselves. But according to my particular discoveries, about 50,000 years ago, our planet was in fact visited by a certain contingent. And I believe, though I'm not absolutely sure, I tend to think that they came from Alpha Draconis. Now later, they're descendants of these people, and by the way, the descendants of these beings I'm going to be talking about are ruling the world today. Not them themselves, but the descendants, the bloodline descendants of these beings rule the world today. So there's a lot of disinformation that's been put out because, of course, they're not going to want to tell their history as it really is. But I tend to think that it was Alpha Draconis, and there's reasons for that.
Now, is that a galaxy?
It's a star.
Okay.
And it has its own constellations. It has its own solar systems and so on. I'll tell you that one of the reasons why I think that is because the Pyramid at Giza, which is one of the greatest, if not the greatest altar on the face of the earth. I mean, the thing's visible from outer space, you know. The descending gallery in that pyramid, which is quite narrow, if you go to the bottom of the gallery and look up, of course it tracks up into the sky, into space. Well, when the pyramid was built, the gallery, almost something like out of Indiana Jones, it focused on a part of the sky which was exactly where Alpha Draconis was. So at the bottom of the descending gallery in the Giza pyramid, if you looked up in the night through this tunnel, you would have seen Alpha Draconis. So I would wonder why on earth would somebody go to all this, effort to build this incredible 13.5 acre, with billions of blocks of stone or whatever, and then, focus only on that star. I think they might be trying to tell us something there. So Alpha Draconis at least is on the hot list of potentials, although Sirius and Pleiades have also been mentioned. But this group that came are known by innumerable names. The Bible refers to them as the fallen angels. The Hebrew translation of that is Anakim or Nephilim, which is the most common name. The Sumerians refer to them, and the Babylonians refer to them as the Anunnaki. And the word Nephilim really means those who were cast down. Those who were cast down out of heaven, so this Luciferian satanic concept. Now, behind all of the posy is the idea that these individuals came into our solar system, but they didn't come here by chance. They're actually being pursued from their own solar system across the galaxy by factions of their own planetary system.
You say this as if we could pick it up in a book and read it.
You can, in fact, but you have to read a lot of books. It's not just in one source. And remember, like anything, it's detective. It can be described as a sort of a esoteric archaeology, where you're piecing the general things together. Because unfortunately, just like a building, imagine a bookstore that's had a freaking Syntax bomb hit it. Yeah, the information's all there, but my God, some have titles, some don't. You don't know what the cover is. So the information is there, so you have to piece it together as best you can in a sort of a forensic style way.
So these characters, the Anunnaki,
the Anunnaki,
were cast out. They were being chased across the galaxy.
That's what it sounds like from many sources, and this does include channelers. I don't totally buy into all of that stuff, but a lot of this does come from people who've channeled and people who've seen, and some of these people are quite credible. But other parts of this is documented evidence. So it's as rational to us as any documented evidence from any time period. You have to be taken as seriously as that. So they say that the Anunnaki were in fact a small contingent being pursued because they've been ousted from their own planetary system. And that whole saga is very interesting, but it's a very separate thing. They actually stray into our solar system, and they first land on the famous 12th planet. Depending on how you're counting, but there was a 12th planet in our solar system that existed between Jupiter and Mars. That's what the asteroid belt is now. It's the remnants of this great planet, and that planet is documented. One of its names was Tiamat. Tiamat is a Scandinavian term that meant the watery one, because Tiamat was, unlike our planet, was almost entirely an ocean planet of seas, saltwater seas, and it was huge. It was many times, 15 and something times bigger than our planet. And Tiamat was actually known in antiquity as the second sun. Not because it was a sun, but because just like Venus on a dark night, it would cast, I mean, it really looked effulgent. And it did that because the rays of the actual sun on its atmosphere just made it seem so resplendent. And in fact, this planet, the Nephilim, put what we might want to call a makeshift or dummy base on there in order as a decoy for their pursuers. And believe it or not, when the pursuers actually arrived here, thought that the Nephilim were on Tiamat, they destroyed it. They actually incinerated, by humanoid effort, this planet in our solar system.
Okay, so you have to pardon me, no pun intended. I'm going to play devil's advocate here, just because you're presenting information that is just quite. It's information. I'm not going to say whether it's true or it's false. I'll leave it up for whoever's listening to decide for themselves. How the hell did you piece together, even to that point, to understand that there was at one point a 12th planet that was covered in water, that there was a base on there that was destroyed and is now the asteroid belt?
Well, this is coming from old documents like the Enuma Elish, which is a Persian book, and the Bundadish, which is another Persian book, and from the Sumerian records. This has been established, especially by Zechariah Sitchin, whose work is very important in this. I have several differences with Zechariah Sitchin's work, but again, I think they're sort of a mute point for this conversation. He has definitely uncovered the old cylinder seals, which talk about this. In fact, in Allen and Dallaire, these two scientists from Oxford and Cambridge University, they've written a book called Cataclysm, and I can read one small paragraph from that. They talk about this. They say, if we elevate the moon to planetary status, as the Sumerians appear to have done, then we have a total of 10 planets orbiting the sun today. On this basis, one planet is still currently missing from the earlier Sumerian total. Could there really have been another planet known to the Sumerians, as yet unknown to us or lost since their day? So these are not some hippie, freaky, channeling New Age, bumpkins. These are the top scientists in the world. You have MIT people like Otto Binder and Max Flint, who are very much looking into this. You have Bode's Law, which is the scientific principle that absolutely says that, mathematically speaking, between Mars and Jupiter there should be another planet there, but it's not there. But what we do have is clusters of orbiting, dust. And in the Enuma Elish, it actually refers to Tiamat. Of course, it does it in poetic language. It says, go and cut off Tiamat's life, and let the winds convey her blood to the secret places.
And which text is that
This
from?
is the Enuma Elish. And it's just one of many books that talk about this. Now, see, again, here, this is a very important point for people to grasp. In some of these ancient books, they're not denotative accounts. They're connotative and they're poetical. And this is one of the reasons why a lot of this information has yet not come forth. Because we, being very left-brain and very sort of what I would consider dumbed down, but we're not using our whole brain anymore. We've lost this ability to decode. We have lost our symbol literacy. We've lost our pattern recognition skills. So when we read this stuff, to us it's just folk tales.
What do you mean? I guess I don't see myself as someone who's necessarily lost my ability to think. How are you?
It's the cognitive centers. We have a society that has conditioned us from educational, right, in our education, to be very right-brained, very linear, very what we would consider factual. But facts are not necessarily truth. What I'm really trying to say is that in a lot of these old texts, just because it's written down in a sort of what appears to be a fanciful way or a fictitious way, we tend to immediately discount it and not, make it as important to us. Look at Professor Tolkien in his Lord of the Rings. I mean, the guy spoke about Celtic mythology. He spoke about Hyperborea and Numenor. He spoke of things that were absolutely known to be existent, but he did it in a fictional way. There's reasons for this. So again, even the most ancient of books, the tendency is to write them in this specific, what might be called, you have to be symbolically literate to decode it. And look at the ancient Egyptians. They didn't write words. They wrote in hieroglyphics. So the whole idea was there on graphic, reference. Now, when the Judeo-Christian paradigm came into town, what did they immediately do? They have an edict in the Ten Commandments that says, thou shalt not make graven images, which was a prohibition against making images of God or images of being or images of meaning. Well, why does that prohibition come before thou shalt not kill? Many scholars like Leonard Schlein have wondered about this. It's more important to not make images than it is to murder somebody? That's right. In Judeo-Christianity, which is, of course, the hegemony that's really in power now, was very much against this idea of figurative representation. But we cannot decode the history of our planet without awakening that again. Now, in these ancient books, it definitely talks about the fact, the presence of a planet, and it's not there now, and most people think it just blew up because of some, intervening comet. This is what Zachariah Sitchin believes, and I do not agree with that. If you read Commons Beaumont, one of the most suppressed authors in the world, his books are very, very hard to find, or Immanuel Velikovsky, who is the, not one of, but the most lambasted, scholars in the world.
In fact, my biology teacher in high school, Kirk Brill, brought up during I think we were starting to talk about evolution, and I don't know if Jake, did you have Mr. Brill, or were you with Mooney?
No, I had Mr. Brill, but I didn't necessarily pay that much attention in his class.
I paid specific attention to this because he brought in papers from Velikovsky talking about how Venus was at one point a comet, and it was trapped somehow in the solar system. I think that was Velikovsky's theory.
That is totally Velikovsky. He was an expert on Venus.
Now, by the way, folks, in my Lucifer series, the screenplay of which is up there, and this started out as a short story, was about all of this and the catastrophe that I described that destroyed Atlantis was based on Velikovsky. So everything Michael is talking about here, I knew about 45 years ago. I had read Velikovsky, Worlds in Collusion, and I based my fiction around the facts that this gentleman is talking about now. Hopefully I will be able to finish this. I've told you I need some help. I need some donations. I need just a little bit of assistance to make it over and above what I get on Social Security. I need a little help. I once had this all working, and the attacks on me have managed to stop all of my support, I had thousands of subscribers, folks. What happened to it? I can't tell you. I don't know what happened, but you can make up your mind.
In fact, many of the discoveries we have today about Venus, not only Venus, but our solar system, come from him because he's been proved right every time. This so-called lambasted visionary, this so-called unscientific, wannabe, has now turned out, after so many years, to be 100% correct, and all his detractors are wrong. So here we have this whole problem again. But Velikovsky also talks about the fact that cometary bodies may have done it. I have subsequently found out that that's not quite true. They were on the right track there, but that the planet was actually destroyed by this humanoid element. It's in the myth and legends if you know what you're looking at.
Tiamat.
Tiamat, yeah. It had many other names. In fact, the word Lucifer, son of the morning, was one of the ancient names of that planet, which wasn't a bad thing. That just meant the son of the morning. And it was called Marduk, Rahab in the Bible. There's been many names for this particular body. And it was 15 times larger than the Earth. And it was actually destroyed because these individuals that were pursuing the Nephilim, now we don't actually know whether these people who were pursuing the Nephilim were any more good or worse. We don't know these things, but...
And we haven't quite gotten to the point where we're defining the characterizations of the Nephilim.
It's really impossible, because, see, there's certain things we know and certain things we don't know. We don't know if those pursuers were equally as evil, or what we might want to call that. It's all relative. But what we do know is that the Nephilim didn't come here by choice. We also know that you don't drive your car through an earthquake by choice. So the destruction of that planet caused immense devastation cosmically. A lot of planets were pulled off their normal orbits. Ancients claim that the moon is a remnant. It certainly looks like a remnant of something with all the pockmarks on it. It's certainly vastly bigger than any other satellite of any other planet. So very quickly what they say is that our planet was in total chaos. And more importantly for us, and remember I'm dating this about 50,000 years ago, the destruction of the water planet Tiamat caused Earth's first deluge. So that famous flood, which is accounted for in every civilization in the world, I don't care what civilization you're talking about, and this was one of Velikovsky's also great discoveries, is he understood that they were not only talking about flood, they all were speaking about it happening at the same time. A great deal of effort had been put into making it look like, or appear to us on paper, that these were all different timings, because remember, every civilization uses a different calendar. So it had been put before us that these cranks, these ancient, shamans and these scribes were utterly talking nonsense because, you know, the times were wrong. But Velikovsky came along, studied every single one of these cultures, made an objective calendar on which you could plot their individual time calendars, and found out they're all exactly at the same time, which is approximately 40,000, 50,000 years ago. Now, this deluge, which means, I mean, space is a cryogenic chamber. But when you have an exploded planet with water, salt water is, you know, streaming through the atmosphere, it's collected in the Roche field and in the stratosphere. It's attracted by the magnetic pull of our planet, which it still is today, by the way, and then a lot of it falls as debris. And that's the famous 40 days of rain, the tremendous climatical upheavals that have been all scientifically approved now. There's not a thing that I'm saying that is not absolutely scientifically documented now.
You mean in terms of there being a deluge?
Right. But not only that, that has been already understood. But what I'll go further than that. It has now been understood that the deluge came from up there.
Wait, is this like a new bit of evidence?
Oh, yeah.
Like, people want proof.
Yes.
They want incontroversial
right.
proof.
All of my stuff has this proof. Allen and Dallaire, their first book on this subject was called When the Earth Nearly Died. Their second book is called Cataclysm. These are the top, and I mean the top scientists in Oxford and Cambridge University who've looked into the whole question of Velikovsky and so on. They conclude that our planet, as von Däniken had been saying years before, had not got hardly any ocean on it. In fact, it didn't have, the only water that was on this planet prior to 50,000 years ago was what we call the Miocene Ocean, which was in Russia where the Caspian and Black Sea are. But the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic and all of the rest of it did not exist. That can be proven now. They're thinking that this destruction of Tiamat might have, and for those who are really into science fiction, we can even add that maybe even the active destruction of these aliens gouged out what we know to be the Pacific Gorge in one go. Now that sounds unbelievable until you realize that it is now officially understood by geologists that the Grand Canyon might have been carved out in one day.
Oh,
yep. This is so. There's a lot of research on it. This is official. This is official fact that it has now been understood that the Grand Canyon at the Colorado River could have actually happened in not maybe one day, but a very short time, a matter of hours and days.
Do they know how?
Yes, they do know how. In these books, you will find evidence of the meteor and the cometary implosions that took place all over the world. I have a lot of information on this in my book. So let's just say for now, you know, we can't push the point because people need to go to the sources and read it, because it does sound preposterous. It's meant to sound preposterous because the world around us has not been explained properly. And Carolina, anyone who's lived in North and South Carolina, in Georgia, know about the impacts of thousands upon thousands of meteors, thousands upon thousands of them that have hit there in times of old. Scholars have discovered that there's something very bizarre about the Grand Canyon, and I think that possibly this recent cataclysm in the solar system may have even precipitated the gouging out of the Pacific. Now, the waters that pour in here, they liquefy. They're probably coming in as rocks of ice, and that's exactly what the ancient legends say. But of course, passing through our atmosphere, they liquefy again and fall as rain. The Celtic books are adamant about this. In the Welsh Chronicle, the Book of Taliesin, there's actually a very famous book. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's called the Book of Taliesin. Taliesin was the great poet of the Welsh. The Welsh have the highest regard for Taliesin because he is like sort of, in one way, a contemporary or a similar being as Merlin. You know, everyone in the world has heard of Merlin. Well, Merlin was actually based on an old Celtic poet that lived many thousands of years before him, but also was the Welsh poet Taliesin. And in his works, Taliesin talks about that the waves, that there was this descent. I have the quote right here. Here it is. This is from again, it's poetic. So he says, I have been in the boat of Dylan. Dylan is the famous a word that means the ocean. Anybody who's called Dylan, it actually means the black waves of the ocean. So he says, I've been in the boat of Dylan, the son of the wave, when the waters rose as lances, falling down from the skies into the exposed abyss. So again, direct verbatim from Geoffrey of Monmouth, from the old scribes, they're talking about this. Wormwood in the Bible, Revelation number 8, verse 8, it says, and the third angel sounded, and there fell a great star from heaven, burning as if it were a lamp. And the name of the star is called Wormwood, and many died from that water because it was made bitter. So the Bible records are talking about bitter waters, which was not known on this earth before. Wormwood, a star in the heaven, and the great lament, and people dying from this tumult. The Navajo Indians, the Zunis, you name it. In my book, I go into this, almost all the traditions to show that this happened.
Cross-culturally.
Yes,
so
it's very important to do that. See, Zechariah Sitchin, one of my sort of peeves with Zechariah, even though he's a great scholar, he is focused almost entirely on the Sumerian-Babylonian record. And there's problems with that. We might get to talk about those later. But yeah, you do need to cross-reference.
You're not the only challenger. As a matter of fact, the Watcher website, I don't know if you're familiar with, I believe he's actually got a doctorate now. And I caught his presentation at the Ancient of Days conference, which is put on by Guy Malone in, of all places, Roswell, New Mexico. And I believe they're going to be doing another one at some point in the near future. Mike Heiser, I believe is his name, and he has also called out Zechariah on a few different points.
And that's inevitable because, and we'll come to that, hopefully, because my analysis of Sitchin goes quite deep. I don't put my differences first because that's just nonsense. Starting to do that would lead you off on so many tangents of who believes in who and who's... You know, we want to get away from that and look at the commonalities, but there are some very important fallacies in Zechariah Sitchin's work. But he also then talks about this lost planet. Now, the most important thing we need to know, I mean, that was traumatic enough, having our planet be, going through this cataclysm. But it was worse because the Nephilim that were meant to be hiding out on Tiamat weren't hiding there at all. They were hiding here on this planet, underneath the tree line, in caves, in the hollow earth caves that they found by doing scans of this planet, and also in some that they carved from themselves. Many scholars specialize only in that area of the underground caves of our planet. Now, given that many continents have already sank beneath the waves, we still have a lot of these labyrinthine caves. I believe that prior to the flood, prior to these other cataclysms, there was even more. That the continents that would have existed, I think, were catacombed with a great deal more. So they claim, and the Celtic legends even talk about, and the Scandinavian legends even talk about, that the fallen angels had ability in their crafts to go under the water. They actually were able to take refuge under the seas. And they were able to successfully hide out, and their opponents, these people that were pursuing them, again, because of the celestial upheavals they had now caused, couldn't stick around too long to, do more thorough research, so they left. And the Nephilim, after a semblance of normality had returned to our planet, emerged from their hiding places, and they grouped themselves on the continent of Appalachia. Now, the continent of Appalachia was in the North Atlantic. It's still there. They've now discovered it. Buried in the North Atlantic, it's fathoms down under the ocean, is an entire continent. And the scientists have given the name of this Appalachia. And it's Appalachia was the continent upon which Atlantis was founded. So anyone who's listening to this, who's already done some homework into Atlantis, please understand that when we talk about Atlantis, there's a lot of disinformation out there. Atlantis was not a continent. And this is one small piece, but I think an important one to clear up. The continent was Appalachia, and Atlantis would be like what Washington is, or a city-state, a city complex. It's erroneous to say, Atlantis was itself the name of the continent. This also brings up a lot of problems if you believe that, because then, of course, what's happening throughout the ages? Everybody who turns over a rock in the Syrian desert says they found Atlantis. It's a perennial thing, right? So, there's that to take on board. But keeping to our story, the Nephilim appeared. They had incredible sophistication. They did set up, they couldn't leave immediately because of the celestial upheaval, so they set up their base on Atlantis, and after that, in the years that followed, they started to actually do reconnaissance, send out contingents of these individuals. Now remember, our ancestors, the individuals who were living on this planet that we know next to nothing about, saw all of this upheaval. I mean, you couldn't miss it, right?
And when you say upheaval, you're talking about stuff that's happening in the sky.
So, I mean, they talk about it. They talk about the sky turning red, the gods, the wars of the gods, the
Vedic text.
The Vedic text, always, and there was horror and fight, fear, tremendous fear, which is still encoded in our DNA today. In fact, in the race memory, we have a lot of fear of certain things, especially the ocean. These fears that have been put down to us, human fears and phobias that are considered to be psychological, are actually physiological, if you get into it. But our ancestors did see this and were really horrified by these travesties that were taking place. And they believed, therefore, when these remarkable beings, who, by the way, were humanoid, these are not reptilians like some people have been saying, they're humanoid, you actually could pass them by on the streets. The real legends, the real mythologies, ones that are credible, say they were probably a little bit taller than us, certainly lived a lot longer, were very highly intelligent. They would point to the stars when they were asked about their origins. They did speak in strange tongues. This whole idea, many records talk about having two heads. That sounds far-fetched, again, if you're using the left brain. But what it really means is that they had space helmets with two faces. One face would look like the helmet, and the real face would be inside. Ancients not knowing how to account for that. You know, like in the book of Ezekiel, you get all of this poetic language from Ezekiel about the strange crafts and so on. So, you know, again, we have to use our right brain to decode what we're actually hearing when we're hearing these references. Now, the Bible is full of the mention, by the way, of this visitation, just as we're on that point here in the book of Ezekiel.
And that's actually in the Bible, as opposed to Enoch, which was left out.
Exactly. Let me read you this from the book of Ezekiel. Anyone can pick up a Bible, go to Ezekiel and read this. It says, and Eve, now we'd wonder why Eve has even been mentioned in a later book, but it says, then Eve looked up to heaven and saw a shining chariot, come drawn by 4 gleaming angels, whose glory no one born of woman could express, nor look upon their face, and the angels went before the chariot. Now, of course, if you're a primitive person, let's say, quote-unquote primitive, and you didn't have technological expertise, you would explain things like that. And the book of Ezekiel and the book of Genesis 15, Ezekiel 1:20, talk about the pillar of cloud and the movement of this, what they also call the whirlwind, that used to clip the mountains and clip the trees. You know, in the book I go into all of this. There's lots and lots of accounts from the Bible of these crafts. But this was seen, and then the Atlanteans, basically moving along with the story, they were making contact with the indigenous population of the earth. Now, as I said before when we opened, there's been many encounters here, probably thousands of them. This one group is special because they decided to intervene in a way that was very much taboo.
So the Atlanteans, are they descendants from the Nephilim?
Yeah, and it's good that you made that point, because now we can in fact refer to, it's good to refer now to these Anakim or the Nephilim as the Atlanteans, because they are the founders of Atlantis. Atlantis was not founded or created by anyone on this planet. It was an alien base. And that has to be firmly understood in order to make sense of where we're going now. These giants, or the Nephilim, they, in the Kebra Nagast, which is another book, like the Enuma Elish, another book is called the Ethiopian Kebra Nagast, which is a very important book. It's as important as the Popol Vuh of the Maya, and it's as important as the book of Enoch. In that book, they talk about the fact that these visitors wanted to interact sexually with the earth female, and they actually tried it. And here's the quote from the Kebra Nagast. And remember, these are old books. Some of these are not even books. They were clay tablets, you know. These are remarkable finds. And you can imagine why a lot of them have been hidden. And it says, and the daughters of Cain, the word Cain goes back to the word meaning serpent, and we'll get into that a little bit later, but the daughters of the serpent, or the daughters of Cain, with whom the angels had companied, conceived. All right, so they say that it kind of worked. They conceived at least. But they were unable to bring forth their children, and they died. And of the children who were in their wombs, some died, and some came forth, having split open the bellies of their mothers, they came forth by their navels. So this is like something out of Rosemary's frickin' Baby, you know. It didn't basically work, right? So the Bible more than hints at it. The ancient books definitely talk about it, that there was company taking place. This is a central theme that can be proven by anyone who's done even 5 minutes of homework into this field. But my work goes on to show that they didn't stop there. When they realized that this was, like, you know, totally not working out, they went one step further. And this one step that they went further, the committing of this great sin, is the thing that changed our history forever. Now, the Bible refers to it as a great sin. In the book of Enoch, they do likewise. In fact, in the book of Enoch, it says, and then Samyaza, this is the name of the leader. There's many names for that leader of these beings. He says unto them, and the direct quote, he says, I fear you will not indeed agree to do this deed, and I alone shall have to pay the penalty of a great sin. What that means is that it implies that even the leaders, these visitors, knew absolutely that they were not going to do something that contravened sovereignty, spiritual sovereignty, genetic sovereignty, whatever. And the scholars of the world, and I mean almost all of the scholars of the world, believe that that still involves impregnation of the females. It does not. It refers to something infinitely worse. It refers to the crossing of the alien DNA with our DNA. This event took place on Atlantis, in the precincts there. It took place in what the Bible refers to as the Garden of Eden, because the word Eden goes back to a term that just means the enclosed space. The DNA, as we know today by looking at it, has always looked like a serpentine shape. It's very serpentine-like. And for thousands of years, the knowledge of DNA, and let's just get that straight, that this is not a modern discovery, as you were introducing earlier. This high science was known millennia ago. This is probably the big hurdle for a lot of people, but, you know, as time goes by, we're not going to have to hide it. It's there for anyone who wants to know about this. The fact is that the DNA has a serpentine look, the DNA helix. And therefore, in ancient times, those who worked with that kind of technology referred to themselves as the people of the serpent. And that also comes from the Hebrew, because the word for serpent doesn't have any vowels, but it's sort of pronounced like Nachash or Nakhash. Nakhash, N-H-S-H, that term also means to find out, or to...
Discover what's really going on in the news that mainstream media won't tell you. Are you frustrated with your elected politicians? Get the news behind the news at truthradio.com. At Truth Radio, you can listen live or listen to a large selection of archived programs on demand. Listen when you want to. truthradio.com. The truth is out there. All you have to do.
Have you heard me offer the videos, the Great Civil War debate, and because VHS is no longer in style, you thought, well, I'll wait till that's available on DVD. Well, it is now. I have that on DVD, and I'd be glad to send you a copy. A DVD copy doesn't cost very much, and I'd be glad to send you the Great Civil War debate DVD, just whenever you ask for it. And our policy is we give, you give. It's just that informal. Whatever it is you feel you'd like to contribute to Truth Radio, just ask for the Great Civil War debate when you write in. If you have any interest in the Civil War at all, this is a debate you just have to hear. Our address is P.O. Box 344, Nipomo, California, zip code 93444. That's P.O. Box 344, Nipomo, California. And the zip code is 93444. Looking forward to hearing from you soon.
Centuries numbered 10 times 10 times. 10 times 10 times 10. 10 times 10 times 10.
All right, we're back here, and I've got a caller. I've got a caller from 312. Are you just listening to the show, or you got something to say? From what, Chicago? Hello, 312 area code. You're in my queue here. Did you, are you just listening, or do you have something to say? I guess you're just listening. So, we'll put them back here. Alright, you are listening to the voice of Michael Tsarion, Alien Visitation, Post-Human World, and folks, I think it's important because I wrote the story of Lucifer 45 years ago. I think it's a pretty good fictionalized story of the destruction of Earth and an ancient race who were thought of as gods and demons. Tsarion has done much more research than I've done, and he came to many of the same conclusions here. You can get the Lucifer, the screenplay for Lucifer that I did for Attorney in Santa Monica, Hollywood, who happened to be Jewish and was a total asshole, as most of the Jews that I have met have been.
Discover. So it referred to scientists. So there's a connection between the symbol of the serpent, the word serpent, snake, and those who are the scientists. We still see this today as the caduceus is used on the medical profession. All over the world you'll see the medical profession using this ancient occult symbol of the twin serpents, right? Because it's understood that the knowledge of biology involves this, and it's a very ancient symbol. We have to understand how to decode these symbols and find out what they mean. So basically the beings that were on this planet pre-visitation were interfered with genetically, just like it says in Genesis 1.
No, wait, come again? Could you run that by me again?
Yeah, that the individuals that we might know as the name of whatever, Neanderthal, Angus, Cro-Magnon, these terms need to be again reviewed, because for what I'm saying, we can't go by official records, but whatever entity was our forefather pre-visitation was made contact, the gods made contact with these beings. They studied their DNA thoroughly. They made diagnostic tests on Atlantis in some sort of hideous, Planet of the Apes type experimentation, and then they crossed their own DNA with our ancestors, creating another entity, which we'll talk about in a minute. But Genesis 1, when it says that God said, "Let us make man in our image," if you go back to the original Aramaic and Hebrew translation of that term, it does not say that. It says, let us the gods remake man in our image. So there's this...
According to whose translation?
The original rabbinical translation. The original rabbinical translation that is actually officially is accepted by rabbis. Okay? And then in Corinthians, if you need more proof than that, go to 1 Corinthians 15. I hope this doesn't sound like a Bible lecture here, but, look at the book in a new way, right? When you open your eyes to the Bible, something amazing, suddenly you start to understand this damn book as opposed to listening to what's coming off the pulpit, which is nothing but propaganda. But you go to 1 Corinthians 15 and it says, it's a remarkable passage there, it's amazing to me they left it in. It says, the first man, Adam, became a living being, the last Adam, a life-giving spirit. So now suddenly, out of the blue, why didn't they teach us this in Sunday school? You got two Adams, right? What are they saying? The first Adam became a living being, the last Adam a life-giving spirit. The spiritual did not come first, but the natural. And after that, the spiritual. The first man was of the dust of the earth, the second man from heaven. It's all there, once we know how to decode what that means. When they mean spiritual, they mean engineered. Spiritual meaning not of the earth. When they say of the earth, of nature, they mean the ordinary dude, the ordinary guy that's made in the normal evolutionary sense. What this term spiritual is a code word, it's a replacement word, meaning of something different going on here. But the very fact they're talking about two atoms, and one of them comes from the heavens, or is made from the heavens. Very interesting thing there. And so I would say that when you hear about this concept of the firstborn in the Bible, which uses that term a lot, we have to understand that it refers to a remarkable being that I refer to in my work as Homo Atlantis, just for the fact that he was created on Atlantis. Now, this being from which a lot of us are descended had alien DNA and human, let's use that term, DNA. And I believe, or my specific work, being more philosophical, traces back this thing about evil. We were talking about the presence of injustice and cruelty and evil in the world. It seems to be just besetting our world for generations, and nobody seems to be able to work it out. This schism, this schizoid being that was created, even though he was extremely advanced scientifically and he had all this human component, unfortunately, the transgenic experimentation created this proclivity that we would know to be evil in the world. Evil has a time and a date. It's not the creation of nature. It's anyone who believes that it is again laboring under a vast folly, a vast misapprehension. How can we, for instance, imagine that nature, which is in perfect harmony, scientists study nature, it's in perfect equilibrium and harmony from the largest neutron star to the smallest quantum particle, what we call the natural order, right? How then can this thing, which is in perfect equilibrium, make such a blunder in its highest species, man, to create something that would undermine her own order, which is this penchant for ecocide and cruelty and belligerence? And by the way, let's not forget, man is very distinct from other primates because he's the only being that actually takes pleasure from his sadism. We certainly see certain kinds of violence in animals, but we certainly don't see pleasure out of it. The human being, sad to say, how many people in this world have asked that question? Not just great scholars, but even laymen. What is it that really, really makes us different from the animal or the primate? Well, are we really ready for the answer? Do we really want the answer to that? The answer is our cruelty to one another, our injustice. Now, my work is to explain this, because I'm not a ufologist. I'm not a person who's really that interested in paranormal subject matter, and I make this clear when I do talks to people who are from that persuasion. I am more from a philosophical background. My central concern is not ancient times. I've studied that for a purpose, because I am fascinated and interested with what's going on now. I am a person who's very much in this world. I'm not just, studying ancient things because I got nothing better to do. I'm tracking something, the origins of evil, because in the 21st century, in a very, very short time, and I predict this in the preface of the Atlantis book, we are going to discover the truth about our origins and our destiny. And along with that, one of the first things that comes with that is the discovery of this thing about the phenomena of evil. How did it come into the world? How did it come into human nature? There's an incredible thesis here to be studied. I'm only making a small movement into it. But it comes from this transgenic experimentation. And the being that was created, I refer to as Homo Atlantis, because he was born or created on Atlantis. Now, the most interesting next stage after thousands of years go by, because, of course, why was Homo Atlantis created? Because he was meant to be a servant. All the books, every single one of them, talks about this being that they were created because they were meant to be a servant race. Remember the old John Milton Paradise Lost idea, better to reign in hell than serve in heaven? Well, the watchers who came here, the Nephilim, wanted slaves, they wanted servants, and this is why they went to all this labor of experimenting on our forefathers to create this race. Now, this race, of course, being advanced intellectually like their forefathers, and also having this other component that their forefathers did not recognize, which is this human component. We might want to call it emotion, some people might want to call it soul. It's really difficult to put words to that, but they had this other component that their alien masters did not have, because the alien masters, of course, had full alien DNA. Well, what this led to was the first exodus, because Homo Atlantis refused after a certain time to, go along with the status quo situation, and actually moved out of Atlantis en masse. They left the precincts of Atlantis, and there's even records that they did it in spacecraft. And they set up their own thriving civilization on another landmass, which was near where the Pacific is today, that was called Oceania, and is better known to scholars as Lemuria. So the Lemurians are actually created by the Atlanteans, but they decide to leave. And from that moment on, they become a rival faction. Now, that's already a vast story, just that fact itself. I mean, one of the greatest texts that talk about this is an Indian Tamil text. The Tamils are people from, Ceylon, Sri Lanka, in the southern part of India. And they have some unpronounceable documents down there of their old legends. The Silapadarakan is one of the books. And they refer to this island in the Pacific. And they actually call it the Kamai Nadu, or the Kamari Kandam, which meant the dragon land of the immortal serpents. Again, a reference to the gods, a reference to great scientists who set up base on Lemuria. And of course now, it all would have ended there, except that the Atlanteans, they did not particularly like this, and they decided to go back to their drawing boards to create another being, a Mark II entity, a Mark II slave. And we might want to call that being Adamic, because the beings that are referred to in the Bible of Adam and Eve are not individuals, and if you think of that, it makes no sense at all. We have to learn, like your American scholar Ignatius Donnelly, who was one of the greatest Atlantean scholars ever lived, he fully understood this, that when you're talking about the Elohim and Jehovah, when you're talking about Adam and Eve, you're talking about multiplicities. This has to be understood plurally, not in singular. So the atoms were created, and not wanting to have a repeat of the first problem, it was decided by the Atlanteans that they would turn off or dumb down the higher intelligence centers of these new slaves, because they didn't want the same rebelliousness before. Now, I mean, my God, today they can sit you in an armchair in some laboratory, stick a couple of probes in your head, and you'll be dumbed down in like half an hour. Think what you can do when you have access to the genome. That's exactly what happened. So the Bible and the ancient books refer to this as being Adam and Eve being sent naked into the garden. Of course, it makes no sense at all until you realize it is not physical nakedness that's being spoken of there. It's another cryptic phrase, another cover story that means intellectual nakedness, psychological nakedness, unintelligent. And they were sent forth. Now, many books were purged that had this information, so we only have scraps left, but one of the most appealing and sensational and utterly amazing references to this is from the Mexican codices. There's very few of them left, but the most important one for people to know about is called the Popol Vuh. I have the quote in my book, and the quote says, "Let us make him who shall nourish and sustain us." Okay, this is the gods talking. They say, "Let us make him who shall nourish and sustain us. What shall we do to be invoked, to be remembered in earth? We have tried with our first creatures, but could not make them venerate us. So then, let us try to make obedient, respectful beings who shall nourish and sustain us.
And what's that from? The Popol Vuh?
The Popol Vuh. So you can imagine now, just reading that one little, caption, how the elites of the world would want to burn and destroy and just genocidally destroy all of them. My God, if this is a sample of what they contain, no wonder. So this Adamic man was to be dumbed down. The Epic of Atrahasis, which is another ancient book, dates to about 2,000 years BC, which was found in Assyria, also mentions this, that the gods wanted to create a slave race in order to just produce food and to do mining and to be basically a primitive sort of creature. But here's the problem. The Lemurians, who had now, gone south, as we say, and set up their own thriving civilization, they had suspected that their fathers might do something like this and had been keeping surveillance over Atlantis just in case. When they actually did find out that their Atlantean forefathers had gone back to the drawing boards, they had a bit of a predicament, or what you might want to call a dilemma, because you see, in a way, the Adamic man, by also having human DNA, was in a way a genetic cousin to the Lemurians.
So, also being a hybrid.
Being a hybrid. Yeah. So the Lemurians, just like you or I, you see, we would say, okay, look, we got free, of that prison, but wait a minute, here's our cousins and brothers all in servitude there without the faintest idea what's going on. Can we leave them, in that state? And they decided, no, that they couldn't. So the story goes that agents, ambassadors from the Lemurians were sent surreptitiously into the fields of Eden, or into Atlantis, or into basically the empire of Atlantis, which is probably now spread all over the world, to make contact with these dumbed-down cousins of theirs, the Adams and the Eves, to try and tell them basically, hey, know ye not your gods, what we can do, you can do also and more, and if you come with us too, where we are, we will awaken you to all that's been hidden from you. And the stories go that the Adams, which were the male component here, were completely not getting it. They just were not responsive. Now this story, of course, became corrupted in the Bible later on. When we unravel it and find the original prototypical stories that the book of Genesis story is based on, you find a most interesting tale. And the Eves, they say, these are the female component, they seem to be attracted or interested in the sons of the serpent, these Lemurians that were coming in.
When you say they say, could you clarify that? In this case, what was based, or what was the book of Genesis based upon?
This was it was specifically based, let's see now, I can't really, this Epic of Atrahasis, the Epic of Gilgamesh, there's a bunch of, it's just not on the tip of my mind right now,
That's
but I'll
fine.
probably contact
it. I was curious.
There are, I have that information documented. There are original texts that the Bible directly comes from. And in that book, in these books, they talk about the fact that there was a little bit of resistance from the Adams, but the Eves were sort of getting it because of some unspeakable attraction to these gods, basically. And they precipitated the move out of Eden. Now, the Bible rescripts this later to make the female the reason for the fall. In fact, they script it so that the serpent that comes into the garden is actually a tempter, the son of evil and all that rubbish, right? Which, of course, if you actually start reading it, makes zero sense whatsoever, because why would God create a Satan and blah, blah, blah? The whole thing becomes a contortion, a Gordian knot of questions. Well, that's because you got the wrong story. Get the right story, look at it from the right way, and suddenly it makes sense. These beings that came in were actually liberating forces. And one of the experts on this particular little saga that I'm talking about right here was the great occultist and theosophist Helena Blavatsky. So anyone who really wants to look into this needs to look into her book Isis Unveiled and the Secret Doctrine, because she has just an encyclopedic knowledge of the texts that go with this period that I'm talking about. I'm glad that you asked me that question of sources, because the real key person there to look into is Helena Blavatsky of the Theosophical Society. She was very much into this. And also in American context, you have Lana Cantrell, L-A-N-A, Lana Cantrell, who wrote a book called The Greatest Story Never Told. It's quite a hard book to get, but it's still available, and she will go into all of this sources as well about this particular area. And basically the Adams and the Eves, they do accompany these new mentors of theirs, the Lemurians, and they do go to Lemuria. Maybe not all, but a vast, enough of a number to make the Atlanteans very, very unhappy. Now we come to the part of the story which was really what we opened with, which was the technology aspect. This is the third time now that the Atlanteans have been snubbed. I mean, I can kind of understand it from their point of view. First of all, you get chucked out of your own planetary system. You come to a planet which is too small, or, you don't even really know why you're here. You can't really readily leave. Then you make a perfect servant who won't serve you. Then you make the perfect servant, but they're seduced away. So it's like 3 times now you've been snubbed.
The Chris Pirillo Show is brought to you by Microsoft Windows Media. Download Windows Media Player 10 at Microsoft.com/Windows Media.
When you say, just before you dive into that they couldn't leave, if they had the technology to get here, why?
Because of the cataclysm that had happened with Tiamat.
The cataclysm, so...
The solar upheavals.
So the
celestial upheaval.
Okay, so something was keeping them
Something was keeping them here. It was so severe, and I'm thinking that there's something that was keeping them here, but I think originally they were just a little bit, they probably wanted to colonize this planet anyway, so I think they had various reasons for staying, not just one, but several. I think one of the things was fear of leaving. They didn't know, for instance, if those pursuers were out there, so they wanted to sort of stick around. Then they wanted to colonize the planet. They realized it was very rich. And I think that there was a fear of leaving. There's a bunch of components, and one very important, all-conclusive reason, but we'll have to come to that in a minute. Where we are in the story now is that
they'd been snubbed.
Yeah, and the wrath. The books describe the incredible wrath of the Atlanteans against the Lemurians, and they respond with what the records clearly describe as a war, an atomic war, a global thermonuclear war.
Whoa.
Yeah.
So we're talking about the dawn of man, the dawn of what we believe civilization is, and it started with a nuclear war?
We're talking about that, not right away. I mean, the coming of these beings was about 50,000 years ago. The war we're talking about was about 14 to 13,000 years ago. So there had been a lot of time elapsed while the building of Atlantis, the colonization of the planet, the various hybridization programs, many thousands of years have elapsed in this time. But around about 13 to 14,000 years ago, there was this war. All the records are now speaking about it. The fossil record is your best, betrayer of this fact, and those who've done their homework, and there are many of the top scientists of the world have proved this now. This is why this information is finally coming out. They have shown that there was something devastating here. Now remember we talked about the deluge? It was originally thought that the evidence that they see in the fossil record from about 13,000 years ago that shows untold extinctions on this planet and just mayhem of unimaginable proportions, they thought that was originally the deluge. That has now been rescripted. They've realized that the deluge, there was 2 things that have changed. And of course there's certain forces who want to make you think it's just one. But they realized that the deluge was a little bit longer ago, and my work also confirms that the deluge was previous to this. The event that we're talking about now was described in the ancient books as the War of the Gods, literally as a war of the gods with the super weaponry that they had. The Egyptian papyrus have the most stunning accounts of this. The book of Revelation, go to verse 12, talks about the war in heaven. The book of Samuel, and a very important book that was left out of the Bible called the Book of Baruch, B-A-R-U-C-H. The Book of Baruch talks about the giants. There's a quote from the Book of Baruch which says, "There were those giants famous from the beginning that were so great of stature and so expert in war." Again, the historian Manetho talks about it. There's a papyrus in Egypt from 2,000 years BC called the Upuar papyrus. All of this stuff is in the book, so don't have to take notes. But the book of Isaiah, there are just absolutely thrilling accounts in all the legends of the world of this horrendous fight that took place. And of course what interests me, and I know interests you, is the fact that great weaponry was used here. So in the book of Job, remember we talked about the symbolic literacy bit? In the book of Job 14, there's a very short passage where it says, "And he shall flee from the iron weapon, and the bow shall strike him through." When we read chapters like that, we have to put it in context. Yeah, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, before we in our Western world had moved into some of the technologies we're discovering now, if you had read that, it wouldn't have made a bit of sense. But see, now, because we're in the 21st century, we can review a lot of this and think, wait a minute, iron weapon, the bow shall strike him through. There's other passages that talk about these super weaponry, and we can start to understand it in a new context. And in a very well-known and sacred Indian book called the Srimad Bhagavatam. This thing is about 50 volumes. 50 volumes, and many of these volumes feature this thing with the War of the Gods. And they talk about there's a passage there which talks about a demon race which invaded the planetary systems. Opposing them was the Hindu god Shiva, who possessed a powerful weapon that he fired at the enemy airships from his own. You know, Ovid, the great Greek, in his book Metamorphosis, he talks about the giants attacked the very throne of heaven, and Jupiter, you know, struck them down. The Norse Edda is filled with it. The Norse Edda is one of the greatest scriptures for this, by the way. It has the most interesting accounts of the weaponry, along with the Vedas. They talk about also the evil afterwind, you know, like the residue, sort of the aftershock, or what you might call the
fallout.
The fallout, yeah. The Norse Edda talks a lot about that. But the most famous accounts, let's say, were before I go on to the Mahabharata, which has the most interesting accounts, there's Exodus 7. I draw your attention to Exodus 7, where it says, "And Moses and Aaron did as the Lord commanded, and he lifted up the rod and smote the waters that were in the river, and all the river waters that were in the river were turned to blood." This bit of, you always hear about the rod, is actually a weapon of some kind. So in the Bible, when you hear that, just remember, you're hearing about a form of weaponry, and if you read the rest of the passage, suddenly it'll start to be clear. But for those who are fascinated by the idea of just focus on this one area, for people who are not even into this whole thing, if they just get a grip on this one area of super weaponry, super technology, ancient technology, this will open up a vast area of research. I'll read a few quotes from the ancient mythologies. In the Mahabharata dates from thousands of years BC, and when it was first written down, those scribes said it was already thousands of years old by that time, which pushes it back to about 20,000 years, 14,000 years, and so on. This is a direct quote from the Mahabharata, the ancient text of India. It says, "The Subha," this is the spacecraft, "the Subhas clung to the sky at a league's length. He threw at me rocks, missiles, spears, spikes, battle axes, three-bladed javelins." Right, we know about those heat-seeking missiles and the ones, what's that, the Scud missiles that split open or whatever? Well, they're talking about the three-bladed javelins, flamethrowers, without pausing. The sky seemed to hold 100 suns, 100 moons, and 100 myriad stars. Neither day nor night could be made out, or the points of the compass. The Ramayana, which is another one of the great Indian texts, mentions an iron thunderbolt capable of killing hundreds of thousands of humans. It was also said to be so powerful that it would have destroyed the earth. These weapons could only be used by royal decree. There's even passages where it mentions the fact that the weapon was used first as retaliation for the other side using it first. I mean, where we heard that story before, right? Then there's a book called the Samargana Sudrahara. There is mention of manned space rockets as well as their means of propulsion. In the book known as the Samara Sudrahara, we find mention of the use of biological weapons, each of which produces its own specific results. There's a weapon called the Samhara, which debilitated its victims by attacking the motor center of the brain. And then the other weapon that they refer to is the Moha, M-O-H-A, which caused blockage of nerve impulses, resulting in complete paralysis. In a Chinese book called the Feng Shen Veni 1, we find descriptions of germ warfare, and again references made to specific weapons causing specific results. We have in the Mahabharata translations of this, because I know your next question is, my goodness, how come we didn't know about this before? Because when the British forces, again, just like they've done in Ireland, when they moved into India and commissioned the translation of these books, they generally left these descriptions out. They would have said they thought they were fanciful. Well, if they're fanciful, then just leave them in and let everybody make up their mind. No, they were left out for other reasons. At Mohenjo-daro in India, just like in the Iraqi desert, there has been crystallized, fused glass found beneath the soil. If you go down there, you'll find what looks like fused glass, implying that nuclear explosions had taken place. They found that at Sodom and Gomorrah, the place where they say that Sodom and Gomorrah took place in the Asia Minor. They found tektites, radioactive tektites to this day. In Scotland, there's a castle with one whole side of it is just fused glass. It's something that hit it, you know. The legends locally talk about the very things we're talking about here. Here's another quote from the Mahabharata, which is very famous. It's in the book. It says, "It was as if the elements had been unleashed. The sun spun round, scorched by the incandescent heat of the weapon. The world reeled in fever. Elephants were set on fire by the heat and ran to and fro in a frenzy. Water boiled, animals died, the enemy was mown down, and the raging of the blaze made the trees collapse. Horses and war chariots were burned up. Thousands of chariots were destroyed, then deep silence descended on the sea. The corpses of the fallen were mutilated by the terrible heat so that they no longer looked like human beings. Never before have we seen such a ghastly weapon, and never before have we heard of such a weapon.
And this wasn't written in, like, 1950. This is...
6,000 years BC, at least. We know that because if you cross-reference it with the Irish text, you're going back that far. Now, another quote from the same... And these are volumes long. I mean, the Mahabharata would probably fill, from here to the ceiling, right? A single projectile, it says, charged with all the power of the universe. An incandescent column of smoke and fire as bright as 10,000 suns, from a shaft fatal as the rod of death. There's that rod of death bit again, which the Bible uses. Endowed with the force of 1,000-eyed Indra's thunder, it was as destructive to all living creatures. Hostile warriors fell to the earth like trees burned down in a raging fire. A substance like fire has sprung into existence, blistering hills, rivers, and trees. All are being reduced to ashes. You cruel and evil ones, drunk with pride, through that iron bolt, ye shall become exterminators of your race. When we read that story about Lot and his wife in the Bible, where it says, don't turn back because you'll turn into a pillar of salt, that's a mistranslation. The original Aramaic, the original Hebrew translation is not salt, it's vapor. The word is much more like our English, you'll turn into a vaporous, you'll just disintegrate. And this, by the way, anyone who wants this translation of the Mahabharata, it is the Protan Chandra Roy. Okay, so it's Protan Chandra Roy's translation in 1889. Has these particular things, but of course, if you just want to get my book, it's all in there. So it says, another quote says, Gurkha, flying in his swift and powerful Vimana, and the word Vimana translates into flying craft, by the way, hurled against the three cities of the Varishis and the Andhakas. These are the two groups that they're talking about. And very much like I've been saying, I use terms like Atlantean and Lemurian. Another one of the most confirming things is they always talk about just two main contingents. Why not 6 or 7 or 5 or 4 or 50? It's always the two, because they're talking about what we've been mentioning here. Well, they hurled a single projectile charged with all the power of the universe. It was an unknown weapon, an iron thunderbolt, a gigantic messenger of death, which reduced to ashes the entire race of the Vrishnis and the Andhakas. So they're talking about both sides had casualties. The corpses were so burned as to be unrecognizable. Now listen to this. The hair and nails fell out. Pottery broke without apparent cause, and birds turned white. After a few hours, all foodstuffs were infected. To escape from this fire, the soldiers threw themselves into streams to wash themselves and their equipment. The weapon was so feared that in great distress of mind, and that's a direct quote, the king had the bolt reduced to fine powder and thrown into the sea. Even with these precautions, people's hair and fingernails fell out overnight. Birds turned white and their legs became scarlet and blistered, and food went bad. We have in Pakistan 44 exhumed skeletons were found. Every one of them was found to be radioactive.
Whoa, when was this?
This is recorded in Jonathan Cray's Dead Men's Secret in the 19th century, and they dated these skeletons to 2,000 years BC. We have, let me see, there's...
2000 BC, that's quite...
Later. You see how late it is?
Yeah.
But again, what do we know about...
If we're talking the timeline...
timeline is a whole other question about who's doing the timing and what have you. Now, the most important part of this, I mean, it just goes on and on. There's, as I said, this is a whole subject in itself. I want to read you one more very, very important quote that I found concerning this vast thing with the weaponry. In the Celtic legend, in the earliest times of conquest of Ireland, now remember, you remember the whole thing with the Luck of the Irish? Here we are on St. Patrick's Day today, and everybody's screaming about the Luck of the Irish, Where that actually comes from is interesting. It comes from what we're talking about. In this Cataclysm, what both contingents didn't realize is that the ferocity of this war would affect the Earth itself. They say that the moisture in the atmosphere basically pretty much incinerated, and that the magnetic polarity of the Earth was affected grossly, and it precipitated what we know as a polar shift. So the event that happened 14,000, 13,000 years ago was not the deluge, but it was a polar shift of our axis. There's lots of evidence we don't have time to go into here to point out that about that time the Earth's axis was straight, so what they call folioform, in which you had what the Greeks call vera perpetuum, perpetual spring. This is known now. The Earth went off its axis. Now, a lot of people put before you again the whole idea of pole shift means the whole reversal of the Earth. It doesn't mean that at all. It can mean a variety of different things, even just a little nudging of the axis. But this thing where we are now, 23.5 degrees or whatever it is, this occurred at this time because of this humanoid ferocity of this battle. They claim that the whole Earth was shaken. Millions of species were wiped out. Vast amount of destruction, like we're saying here. The moon was drawn even closer to our orbit. Mars was affected badly. There was tumult. Remember, we were talking about other reasons why the Nephilim couldn't leave. They had now precipitated something they had no idea. It's like an H.G. Wells' idea, he says, where the Earth responded to man's violence, and then Earth's violence. It's very true what he's saying there. None of the sides realized this was going to happen. The Earth literally around them starts moving now. What we have to understand is that deluge is one thing, even bad as it is, rocks and water falling down from the heavens and all sorts of calamity like that. That's horrendous. And after it takes hundreds of years to even a semblance of normality to return to the Earth. Pole shift, on the other hand, is a completely different thing. That's like, the Eiffel Tower stuck headfirst in Hawaii. That's boulders the size of mountains, flying through the air. I mean, it's unimaginable. They say the whole Miocene Ocean, which was at one point a time in Russia, spilled out and became the Mediterranean, leaving only the Caspian and Black Sea. Nothing could even, begin. It's written in our DNA. I mean, this is mentioned in our racial memory, but nobody can describe this. The scientists and anthropologists who've studied the flora and the fauna and the destruction, and these things called erratic boulders, which are found thousands of miles away from where the outcrops of rock were. They've discovered all of this. This is monumental cataclysm. Well, this event, what did it do? It sank the great continents. Not just Atlantis and Lemuria, there were 3 other ones that the ancients talk about. There was actually 4 continents in all. Appalachia, there was one called Tyrrhenia, which is where the Mediterranean is now. Oceania, which was Lemuria, and Beringia and Thanoscandia. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different continents that sank beneath the ocean, and that's exactly what the Celtic legends say. In the earliest books of the Celts, when they say, hey, where you guys come from? They say, we come from 4, like an archipelago of islands. So again, another disinformation about Atlantis being the only thing that sank. There was many great continents that spanned the Earth which were gone forever beneath the ocean. And that accounts for why today, when Jim Allen and many of these other well-meaning researchers go and they turn over a rock and go, I found it, it's Atlantis. No, that's another outpost or station or whatever. It doesn't necessarily mean it's Atlantis itself. Now, when I get back to this thing where the Celtic legends, when the luck of the Irish, when they survived, the remnants who might have survived this tumult, get into boats, just like in the Mayas, they even show you pictures of it. I mean, you can go to the Maya and see pictures of the guys rowing away from this almighty, sunken island and stuff like that. There's actually images of this. In Ireland, there was a succession of 5 invasions to Ireland, and they called Ireland the Blessed or the Fortunate Isles because it had survived. It was one of the land masses that they were able to settle on, and that's where you get the original idea of Irish being lucky, because the land there was considered our salvation. And it's very interesting, beautifully poetic, it's mostly poetic, in fact, about the fact of the relationship with people with Ireland. That's also why mountains are sacred, because mountains were at that time the only place where people could have survived, you see. So the mountain entered our mythologies as being sacred, the sacred mountain, which was the salvation of man. But the 5th race that came to Ireland were the high magicians. In Irish mythology, there is no bones made about it at all. That each of these races was unique, they had godlike powers, but if you count the original indigenous people of Ireland, these very strange hybrid beings that were there, then it's the 5th race that came, and they were called the Gaelic people. And the Gaelics were the high Druids. So when we're talking about the Druids, we're talking about a specific group of people. They had a king whose sword, by the way, is the prototype of Excalibur. So for those who are into the Arthurian legend, this Gaelic tribe that came, every member of it is the prototype that later was rescripted in the story of King Arthur.
All right, that's it. FreeAmerican.com, make a donation, keep me on the air, where maybe we will continue this tomorrow. God bless you, have a great day.